It's that time again, a new episode of Critical History. Today, instead of following the format of the last few episodes, we will look at something a little bit more abstract, the importance of history. The reason we should care, investigate, study, and of course, be critical of history. Now, in my opinion, you may as well ask, what's the usefulness of listening to music? Yawning already? This is an interesting question, and I can't really claim to have given it much thought, because history has pretty much always fascinated me. But that's because instead of memorizing a king list or the date that something happened, I've always tried to understand the larger trends, the different eras, such as the discovery of the New World, the Age of Exploration, the Napoleonic era, and the impacts lasting over centuries that each of these had. Over time, what started to interest me the most was all the revising that history has undergone. Now, of course, it is easy to accuse me of revising history for disagreeing with aspects of official history, but if it is true that something has been revised or recontextualized, then trying to figure out the truth is hardly revision. Now, maybe you're saying, what's the big deal if something was revised a little here or there? Well, it could mean the difference between if an event was a civil war or a foreign invasion, the difference between self-defense and murder, the difference between suicide and homicide, a freedom fighter or a terrorist, or in more extreme cases, the difference between a protest and an uprising, a war of conquest or a war of liberation. In short, it could mean the difference between justice or injustice, truth and lies. To use a controversial example, not because I think this was the case, but to illustrate my point, what if the Spanish Reconquista of hundreds of years ago was simply a conquista? Or if the European wars of religion were more about politics and spheres of influence and wealth than religion? This, in my opinion, is where the study of history is of the most use in modern times. To show us how much our view of events can change based on the context with which we have been provided. Probably the best modern example has been the push to accuse Donald Trump of Russian collusion, which is then supposed to delegitimize his election and presidency. Instead of asking if there was a better candidate or a better campaign could have been run against him, the entire conversation has become about Russian collusion. Call me crazy, but I thought that animosity existed between the USSR and the Western world, the ideologies of capitalism and communism, not between the countries of America and Russia. After all, if America and Russia are such steadfast historical enemies, why did Russia sell Alaska for such a cut-rate price? Not to mention that the Soviet Union and America were allies as recently as World War II. One of the common trends a study of history reveals is that of constant recontextualization, or in simpler terms, rebranding. One of the more blatant recent examples of this would be the private military company Blackwater that rebranded itself as XE and then Academy. These days they go by Constellus Holdings and Triple Canopy. That's a lot to keep track of. Another good example might be if a nation wanted to get its population on board with the development of nuclear-equipped intercontinental ballistic missiles. You might want to tell everyone your nation is involved in a space race. History also shows the disturbing trend of dehumanizing one's enemies before outright war is waged against them. A good recent example of this could be anti-German World War I propaganda, or perhaps the claim that was made before the first Gulf War that Iraqi soldiers were taking babies out of incubators and throwing them onto the floor. These days, you can get pretty good mileage out of dehumanizing your enemies by calling them racists or Nazis. In short, a critical study of history should give us predictive value about the future and provide context for the present. Now that we've spent a little bit of time discussing why a critical study of history is important, not to mention interesting, I want to take a minute to read out some quotes about history from great thinkers of the past. This is from Philip K. Dick. The basic tool for the manipulation of reality is the manipulation of words. If you can control the meaning of words, you can control the people who must use those words. Now, that's an interesting quote for me because these days it seems that we deal with constant redefinition of words. Here's a few quotes from George Santayana, a philosopher and historian. And I believe Edmund Burke said the same thing, but George Santayana is quoted as saying, "Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Another classic from George Santayana, "History is a pack of lies about events that never happened, told by people who weren't there." An honorable mention by him would be, "A country without a memory is a country of madmen." Here's a quote from a Japanese Buddhist leader, Daisaku Ikeda. He says, "To communicate the truths of history is an act of hope for the future." John Eliot is quoted as saying, "History shows us that people who end up changing the world are always nuts until they are right. Then they're geniuses." Michael Crichton, one of my favorite authors, is quoted as saying, "If you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You are a leaf that doesn't know it is part of a tree." There was a French philosopher and political theorist by the name of Jean Bodin who said, "The study of history is the beginning of political wisdom." Also Jean Bodin, "History teaches us the mistakes we are going to make." Here's a good one from Carol Quigley, who is a little bit infamous as being one of Bill Clinton's mentors. This doesn't mean I'm a fan of Carol Quigley or Bill Clinton, just that it was a good quote. "The history of the last century shows that the advice given to governments by bankers was consistently good for bankers, but often disastrous for governments." And here's a Napoleon quote, "History is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon." And one last quote, "If you liked this video, smash that like button, hit that subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, and tune in next time for another episode of Critical History."